All right, welcome back. This is Inside Pages on Metro Television. Sorry about that. This is Inside Pages on Metro Television. I did promise you that we're going to start our conversation this morning with the Member of Parliament for the Baku Central, that's the Honorable Ayariga. He's written a very powerful piece and cautioning the central bank governor to desist from doing certain things. Now, we've got to situate this within the context of the debt exchange program and the fact that government is talking to its creditor investors and trying to get them to give it some breathing space so that it will be able to pay its debt at some point. And you know the back and forth the government has had with both associations or institutions and also individual bondholders, of which the meetings are still going to be happening. In fact, 7th January is the deadline for everybody else to sign up to the new offering. So that government then issues a new prospectus or memorandum, as the financial guys will tell you, that spells out what has been agreed with who and what has been agreed. So, but the Honourable Member of Parliament has written a piece and drawing attention to something that he believes is extremely important that Ghanaians must pay attention to. And so once the original composer of the song is here, there's no point doing a rendition. So he will tell us why he's decided to alter this piece and also what he intends to achieve with this article that he has authored. And you would realize that he's actually been making the rounds in the course of this week. Most of the media houses have actually reported it quite widely. Fortunately for us, he's here. I doubt he's spoken to any media house about this, so we're lucky. Yeah, that's what happens on Inside Pages. So let's do this quickly. I'm going to read to you what the headline. How he decided to headline this particular article that I'm talking about. You can call it a love letter to the central bank governor. So this is how he decides to caption it. Sorry about that. I'm opening my iPad is a bit slow, but it would open shortly because I want to do that before I introduce it. But first of all, Honorable, good morning. It's good to see you. How are you? And you've been out of town. In fact, you just came back this morning. Right. Oh, please put your microphone on. It's been off. Yes. Yeah, but how was your trip?
It's okay. Just some issues, some legal practice issues.
Right. Yeah. You've been out in and out of town for some time now.
Yeah, some of it on ECOWAS Parliament assignments.
Okay.
We're in Guinea-Bissau for an extraordinary session of the ECOWAS Parliament, which is taking place in Bissau.
Okay.
Yeah,
You're asking the central bank governor to stop the illegal expropriation of the property rights of owners of domestic private banks. How do you mean?
Well, good morning once again to you and to your listeners. I think what is happening is that there is some creeping expropriation of the interest of existing holders of domestic banks. And people really are not noticing that that is what is happening.
Okay.
And the unfortunate thing is that these owners of these domestic banks are reluctant to speak openly because they are licensed by the central bank. No matter what we say about the independence of the central bank, it's obvious that we're a human institution and there's some element of politics. So that independence hasn't really been asserted as much as we expect.
Right. Some would say the central bank is independent on paper.
Exactly. Right. So, through some maneuvering, ultimately, what will happen is that the owners of the local banks, that's the indigenous banks,
right,
will lose their interest in their banks,
okay,
will lose control over those banks. And this is how it's happened. The first time when we had this so-called banking sector cleanup exercise, and some bank, and then the central bank also increased the capital adequacy ratio, demanded that banks should shore up their capitalization.
Yeah.
Because of the banking sector cleanups, a lack of confidence in the banks, and a lot of the banks were struggling. So the finance minister came up with a package and said that they should go to Ghana Amalgamated Trust, PLC, GAT, and take some support. Now, this is how GAT structured the support. GAT came to government, got government to give them a sovereign guarantee for 2 billion, Ghana cedis. And then they were supposed to use the sovereign guarantee to go and look for private financing. And they then used this private financing to invest in these banks in the form of preference shares.
Right.
So students of company law, you will know that preference shares means that that shareholder has preference over ordinary shareholders.
That's VIP shares.
In the case of liquidation,
right.
You get served first before any other person, and voting rights and etc. So they bought preference shares in these banks. Then and the thing that happened was that in the midst of the crisis, there was some maneuvering that led to the values of these shares being depressed. So they bought them at a cheaper price.
Right.
Because these are desperate banks that if they don't get capitalization, they are likely to fold up. So in a situation like that, your share value will be depressed.
True.
So GAD would have gotten these shares at depressed values.
Right.
Then within a short time, the central bank then pushes a few things here and there, and then these banks get to stabilize a bit, and then the share value is supposed to increase.
Right.
But then again, this doesn't happen. GAD then says, we want to issue an IPO so that we can sell these shares in the stock exchange. And even though the values of these shares have increased, the IPO will not reflect that increased valuation. And then, as will happen in Ghana, like we saw in the PDS case, people might just be lined up behind the scenes to take these shares at these, improperly valued state of these shares.
Right.
And then they could be passed on to third parties in very interesting ways. So I saw that. So I objected, and I wrote to the central bank governor, and then, he wasn't really responding the way I thought he should respond. So I went to court. I went to Supreme Court to declare what was happening as unconstitutional. It's been close to 2 years now. The matter hasn't been heard. It was just yesterday that my lawyer, Tadio Sori, got, hearing notice. So we'll be going back to the court. Then this situation arises where the same finance minister, borrows beyond our means and puts this country's financial infrastructure into grave danger. And so all of a sudden tells the banks that close to 100 billion that I have sold bonds to you for certain coupon rates, I cannot pay you. You have to restructure the bonds. You have to trade it in, bring it in, and take new bonds so that we have a deferred payment, we have a reduction in the coupon rates, and etc. Now, these banks bought these bonds understanding that it will yield them certain amounts at certain times, and so their whole financial plan was based on receipts from the coupons. And then all of a sudden, you tell them that they can't get it. Clearly, they will struggle. And then he says, oh, don't worry, I'm creating a Ghana Financial Stability Fund for you. But go to GAT again, go to GAT and then sit with GAT and then figure out how you can arrange something and then get money from it. First and foremost, I don't know where he's going to get money for this Ghana Financial Stability Fund, because I'm in Parliament and I haven't seen him bring any proposal to us for financing. So GAT, and we'll get to the legal structure of GAT later. Right. GAT itself, I'm wondering, how are you going to get the money? Okay? So are you going to give GAT another sovereign guarantee, and who will respect our sovereign guarantee? What will be the value of our sovereign guarantee, given the circumstances in which we find ourselves? So really, how is God going to find the money? Or where is the money going to come from? Is it going to come from the central bank? And if it's coming from the central bank, why must it pass it through GATT to these banks? Why doesn't the central bank just arrange a package with these banks and then we're all watching? Because the central bank is clearly a public institution. Why will the central bank take public money and pass it through GATT to pass it to the struggling banks? You see, all these clearly are shady, some maneuvering that, in my opinion, if we don't step out there and open our eyes and defend these indigenous bank owners, they will maneuver, find money through GATT in the current depressed state of the banks, force them to sell preference shares to them at values that don't reflect the actual values of these banks. And then, after a while, they will offload these preference shares through an IPO, and then that will be it. The owners of the banks will lose control over their banks because the majority shares would have been taken by third parties. And then, who are those third parties? I mean, frankly speaking. So this is the greatest threat to property rights. I mean, so sophisticated in the mechanism in which it is going to be executed. And people say, but Mr. Ayariga, why are you the one making so much noise? And why are you not letting the bank owners talk? They can't talk. These are people licensed by the same government. And so they can just see what is happening to them, but they can't talk. I mean, in all this debate about domestic debt exchange, what have the banks said? Generally, very careful about what they will say. But the individual bondholders, haven't you seen them jump from media house to media house, threaten demonstrations, threaten whatever can be threatened under the sun?
They have nothing to lose.
They have nothing to lose because government can do nothing to them.
Right.
I mean, the banks are even in a worse state. But trust me, they can't talk. Somebody has to step out there and then speak for them. And Ghanaians have to realize the predicament in which they find themselves and rally behind them so that their interests in these banks are not taken away in the way that I see that it will be taken away. So basically, that is the basis of the communication that I sent to the governor of the central bank, because primarily he is responsible for the health of the financial sector of the country. If the financial sector collapses, I mean, trust me, so many things will collapse. I mean, some of the things that we are suffering from today is a consequence of the near collapse of the financial sector arising out of the mismanagement of the so-called financial sector cleanup exercise. Because if one bank collapses, it collapses with several hundred, sometimes thousands of companies. Because banks just do financial intermediation. They take money from somewhere and then they give it to those who need it. And those who need it most likely are companies. Right. Small, large, whatever it is. And so when the bank collapses, it means that those who need money to grow their businesses, they lose that opportunity. That facilitation doesn't happen. And so when they collapse, jobs also collapse. And an economy that is suffering from that kind of situation, will wobble. Because if people are not working, they can't pay taxes. Right. If businesses are not doing well, they can't pay taxes. So you don't have revenues coming to the state for the state to pay its debts. So the state will default in the payment of its debts. And that's what exactly has happened to us.
Right. When I look at point number 2, you're contending that the directive of the Minister of Finance, of course, you've talked about that already, but the reason why I'm repeating is because I want to ask my follow-up question. You're contending that the directive of the Minister of Finance to those banks he has so emasculated to approach the Ghana Amalgamated Trust PLC, which is GATT, for support from the Ghana Financial Stability Fund, opens them up to a takeover by investors in the GATT if the Ghana Financial Stability Fund is not wholly publicly funded. Question is, why are you so particular or concerned or worried about the persons who may have loaned money or credited money to GATT, these private, individuals, of course, through that sovereign guarantee which the government of Ghana has given GATT? Why are you so particularly worried about them? And look, you need money. Does it matter who gives you the money?
No, it matters.
Why?
It matters because the mess in which the banks find themselves is not entirely a function of either their failures or incompetence.
Okay.
The mess is the result of the wrong policy options pursued by the finance minister.
Right.
So he put them
In that
situation in the first place.
Okay.
Now, if we realize that our wrong financial policies have created a messy situation for banks and they need to be assisted, we must anchor that assistance on a mechanism that doesn't lead to they losing their control over their banks.
Why do you think they will?
They will because let me just give you a simple picture. Let's say a bank is capitalized at 100 million.
Right.
Now the banks use some of their money to buy bonds, and they expect revenues because you can't pay the coupons on the bonds and then the principal itself. The bank doesn't have money to do its basic job of loaning money to people and etc.
Absolutely.
And the central bank requires that it keeps a certain amount. Now, they will have to look for money elsewhere, and then you say, oh, go to Mr. X and go and take the money. They go to Mr. X, and Mr. X says, well, I'm not just going to give you the money. So let's say if it were the state may say, yeah, I will give you the money, I will take the shares, but I don't have a problem the state giving the money and taking the shares because then it is all of us who now own the bank,
right.
All of us citizens of Ghana who now own the banks. And then along the line, we can have an arrangement with the banks that say, okay, we're holding these shares, but anytime you find money, come and redeem the shares. Come and redeem the shares. Okay?
Right.
So you get to continue to exercise control over your bank.
Right.
If it is not the state, and then God goes to a private individual, takes his money, and then puts the money in these banks as preference shares. Now, the rights and powers of the original shareholders gets diluted.
Yeah.
So he owns 100% of it. It's possible that the capitalization requirements may push him to a point where he now owns just 40% of it. And then GAT owns 60%.
Right.
Then GAT now goes to an IPO and then at the stock exchange sells off the 60%. A new person automatically comes in. A new person that this existing bank owner probably doesn't even have any relationship with, doesn't want to do business with. But somehow GAT has sold shares to that person in an IPO. So he owns it. He now comes and then he owns 60%. The original owner of 100% now becomes a 40% owner. And then we're still, along the line, the 60% owner will now start maneuvering to even sack the 40% owner.
True.
So through no fault of theirs, through the mismanagement of the financial sector by the finance minister and his team, they have been put in a situation where ultimately they will just lose their assets.
Right.
And that's what I think we should be watching out for, and that's what I think we should prevent.
You're saying that this debt exchange program and the situation it has put especially the banks and the reality that they may have to fall on GAT for some assistance can create conditions for some individuals whom these financial or these banks do not want to have a business with to take the banks from them clandestinely.
And knowing the way some of our colleagues in the NPP and in government have functioned, I mean, using PDS as an example, okay?
Right.
I have no doubt that ultimately those who are going to take these banks, would have certain political connections.
Right.
And that it will just ultimately be cronies lined up to take over the property of people as a result of some mechanism that the finance minister and his team would have created. And that's for me what is even more worrisome, that you deliberately or inadvertently create a horrible situation for these banks, and then you seek to profit from it by expropriating them of their assets. And I think that the state and all of us as individuals must stand up and ensure that this doesn't happen. And the central bank governor in particular must keep an eye on this. And then, we parliamentarians must fight to make sure that this doesn't happen. Okay. And ultimately, if it has to be the courts and if it has to be civil society, we must. Because, you see, you may think that somebody is powerful so he can fight for himself, but it's not really. Anybody who operates on a license from the state will think twice before fighting the state. So don't just assume, oh, well, bank owner, so why should I worry fighting for him? I mean, there are situations where the bank owner needs your support.
Right.
And you must understand that the financial sector is the lifewire of an economy. Mm-hmm. And if it collapses, you can imagine what will happen to all of us. What we are suffering now is the result of some collapse in the financial sector.
Right. So you've talked about the operationability, or let's say the way this whole GATT vehicle is being operated.
Yeah.
But then the second part of your article also looks at the legality.
Yeah.
In terms of the legal basis for the formation of GATT.
Yeah.
And we'll get there, because that's extremely important.
Sure.
And what Parliament can do in this situation. Now, there's a man who has decades of experience in banking.
Yeah, sure.
He sent this message. He says, please ask the Honorable Muhammad Ayariga why he thinks that it had to take 2 years to get hearing at the Supreme Court. He's speaking he wants to speak your thoughts as a lawyer. And then he says, my second concern is about the abuse of sovereign guarantee in the whole exercise. Now, he says, today's failure to pay, so he said the failure to pay debts to the banks was a major reason for the problems. So why didn't government borrow by itself to pay up its indebtedness?
Exactly.
For example, to Unibank, which was a big bank, which will address the root cause of the problem.
Yeah.
So he talks about government. So he says government failure to pay its debt. That's what he was trying to. So sort of agrees with what you're saying. Now, so would you want to respond to what guess can you hazard as to why you think that it's taking 2 years for you to get a simple hearing?
Well, for me, I filed the suit. We went through the processes. We're waiting for hearing date. I didn't hear anything. But what really made me not to push too hard for a hearing date is that what I was seeking to stop was stopped. You see, the IPO was suspended.
Right.
Stanbic Bank was nominated by GATT to handle the IPO for them.
Right.
When we went to court, not long after, Stanbic Bank wrote a letter suspending the IPO. It is the IPO that would have led to these banks losing their hold.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Right.
Because the shares are still held by GATT.
Right.
Now, GATT has some very interesting legal character. Mm-hmm. And so once the shares are still held by GATT, and the IPO hasn't taken place, I also sat back and I was watching them.
Okay.
It is only yesterday that I received a message from my lawyer that upon me bringing up these issues again, he's received, hearing notice of a hearing date.
Right.
So that I believe will be pushed.
Okay.
But then the IPO itself was suspended by Stanbic.
Okay.
So that was why I also just kept quiet and I was watching. And I will fight it. I will fight that, and I'll fight this current attempt to make sure that they force the banks again to go to GATT. Yes, the Financial Stability Fund, if it is a public fund, must be run by the central bank or by some statutory institution established by Parliament, in which we will make sure that there are guarantees to protect people who go there to take money.
What information do you have? Do you have any information as to whether any financial bank or any financial institution has taken advantage of this GATT offer?
Oh, not yet, because this letter was written to them last week, asking them to approach GATT.
Yes.
And so,
but remember, GATT was created in the.
Oh, you're talking about the earlier one.
Exactly.
Yes, the earlier one. GATT, yes. GATT did put money in these banks.
Yes, 2 billion.
Yes, GATT did not exactly 2 billion. I think somewhere around 1-point-something billion, or even 600 million. Yes, not the entire 2 billion.
Has it been disbursed? Has anybody applied for it?
Yes, the banks took it.
The banks took it.
Okay. It did help them to stabilize, which is good. Mm-hmm. But having
the commitment and legality based on your write-up.
Yeah, I have asked about the legality. Why the state will give sovereign guarantee to what is supposed to be a private entity to go and take money and then put in banks. Now, if I had the option, I would rather pass the money through the central bank. But they opted to use that mechanism. And the reason why I say that it's difficult to even understand the legal character of GATT is that GATT is, a company a limited liability company established with shareholding by another private institution. And that private institution is supposed to be holding those shares on behalf of the Ministry of Finance. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to mention the name of that private institution because I don't know to what extent they were coerced into that arrangement, and so it's not fair to mention their names. But it's public knowledge. If you go and do your research, you will see who the shareholder of GATT is. So basically, the question that I had is, why didn't you just come to Parliament under some certificate of urgency, and within a day we could have passed a law establishing some legal institution for you to pass this sovereign guarantee to, so that they can go and lend the money, and then they will do what GATT is supposed to do. And then why couldn't we structure it in such a way that ultimately the banks have to pay the money back to GATT? They have to redeem the shares under some arrangement, and then make sure that GATT is not then given the opportunity to go and do an IPO and then sell these shares to third parties. That is my principal concern, the fact that GATT is seeking to sell these shares to third parties. I believe that the arrangement should be such that the existing owners of the banks would come back and buy the shares back and continue control over their banks. That is my major problem. The fact that GATT is doing an IPO to sell these shares in the stock exchange to third parties.
But what will stop these original owners from buying back the shares if they can? Or, for instance,
but why would you?
So they should be given the first option of option of refusal. There's a term you guys use.
Yes, there should be an arrangement where they buy these shares gradually.
Okay.
You see, in an IPO, often you seek to reclaim the entire investment at the same time. But you could say, look, we give you 5 years, 6 years, 7 years to redeem these shares. So they know that every year when they make some profit, they should go and then redeem 20% of the shares, 30% of the shares. Ultimately, in 5 years, they would have recovered the entire, control of their banks. So any arrangement that, in my opinion, leads to these original shareholders of these banks, the owners of these banks, losing control over their bank is my concern. And I think that it's not fair, especially given that the problem is not a result of their incompetence and etc. It's an external factor. It's the financial sector being run aground because of the way that the finance minister has mismanaged it.
Now, I talked about, and that's good. That's going to be the concluding part of this conversation, because the illegality part is extremely important. I mean, we've set up a vehicle which, per your legal opinion, doesn't have any right to exist because the right processes and the right procedure hasn't been followed. This is what you say. I refer again to previous correspondence exchanges with your office in the past of the issues of the legality and impropriety of the existence of actions of GATT, for which reasons I had to proceed to the Supreme Court to seek to stop GATT. The matter is still before the Supreme Court. The finance minister has again announced a Ghana Financial Stability Fund without any parliamentary legislation establishing such a fund. There is no law defining the sources of financing for the fund, and no legal framework for its operationalization is known beyond the scanty public pronouncements of the finance ministry. The governor of our central bank must ensure there is transparency and legal certainty anytime an intervention of this nature is proposed for the banking and financial sectors. What is it that should have been done that hasn't been done, for which reason you have grave concerns about the legality or otherwise of GATT?
If you establish a Ghana Financial Stability Fund, Ghana, the word Ghana gives an indication that this is a public institution.
Right.
And you say a fund First, we need to know what is the source of the fund. So finance minister hasn't told us where the money is coming from. Is the money coming from the central bank? Is it the same old model of GATT where GATT goes to the financial market to go and borrow money and come and lend to buy preference, force these companies to what do they call it? Sell preference shares to them. Is it the same model? So that model already I'm fighting.
Right.
Now, the key issue is once you say Ghana Financial Sector Stability Fund, it presupposes a public institution.
Right.
Have you come to Parliament to seek a legislation to establish a public institution? No. Where is the source of the fund? Uncertain.
Right.
So clearly there's some shadiness about the way in which they are handling the situation. And we as parliamentarians have a responsibility to force them to open up and then let us know exactly how they're going about things. Luckily, Parliament is resuming on Tuesday, and so there is that platform to be used to wage a relentless fight for greater openness in the mechanisms that the finance minister seeks to use to get us out of this financial mess that his reckless and incompetent management of the finances of this country has plunged us into.
And that's why here you say mobilizing to defend property rights, also the private owners of indigenous banks. And you're saying that flowing from the above analysis, the full force of the democratic institutions of Ghana must be mobilized to protect the property rights of the owners of indigenous banks in Ghana. Parliament must fight relentlessly to ensure that the framework for salvaging the banks and insurance institutions in the wake of the forced crashing of the finances of Ghana through well-calculated greed of the Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta is governed by carefully thought-through legal and institutional framework that protects them from the potential of takeover by selfish parochial forces, as we're witnessing now. Now, that raises another question. And you said, for instance, the shareholders of GATT. It takes that you don't want to mention their names for obvious reasons because you don't even know the circumstances under which they got there. But are these shareholders people who are close to the system? Are they friends and,
I don't want to get to that level.
No, but it's important.
No.
One of the reasons why you're concerned is because one of the reasons why you've actually authored this article, because you don't want these banks to end up in the wrong hands. And I'm using wrong here, in quote.
For me, it's not that those hands are wrong.
Okay.
I don't want existing owners to lose their banks.
It doesn't matter. Okay.
Are you getting the situation?
I get it.
Existing owners, even if the banks were to end up being owned by me,
yes,
my conscience tells me that it's not fair.
Yeah,
that
it's not right.
Existing owners of the banks will lose control over their banks. For me, that's the primary concern.
When it is no fault of theirs.
Exactly. And the first part of that paragraph, you see, when a fight starts, very often people distance themselves and say, this is not my fight.
Yes. I was getting there.
Yeah, this is not my fight. It's about bank owners, it's about rich people. This is what people said until one early morning they woke up and they were told that there are small monies in bonds at data bank, at wherever, okay, pension funds and etc., that they no longer will be getting income from it. This is how we started. That what Ken Ofori-Atta is doing is his business. Is NDC people matter.
It's politics.
It's politics.
Yeah.
Until they woke up one early morning and realized that the politics had arrived at their doorsteps. They were losing the monies that they used to pay their rents, to pay their electricity bills, their water bills, their children's school fees, and then to feed their families.
Right.
So if you just think that this fight is about owners of banks and so you don't care, trust me, it will get to you in no time. Because there's a way in which your financial system is connected to everything that you do and your own day-to-day life. So let's not just discount the issues and refuse to participate in the effort to protect these bank owners. And, I mentioned that every institution must be galvanized because sometimes we think that our democracy doesn't work. Sometimes it doesn't work because we haven't tried to make it to work. We haven't tried to make it to work.
Right.
So we all have to make it work. Civil society, parliamentarians, and the courts must understand. For instance, courts primarily must understand that the constitutional protection of the right to property, is that okay?
Right.
In modern days, the nuances of property rights and how it can be taken away,
right,
can be so complex that not every judge sometimes even understands how to unpack it. Okay? And so we should be very interested and we should pay attention in case the matter gets to us. And, we understand fundamentally what it is about, to do justice. And then also parliamentarians. I mean, when Parliament resumes next week, I'm going to, reach out to my colleagues, and then I believe that we have to use whatever medium is available within Parliament to compel Minister Ken Ofori-Atta to open up, to bring everything before us. We will all scrutinize it, and then the public will get to advise us as parliamentarians on the proper direction to take. In the meantime, I bring this up now because the banks are being shepherded to GATT, and there are timelines within which they must act. And so, whilst waiting for Parliament to resume, I thought that this matter must come out now so that members of the public, civil society, professors, and people whose voices matter, should also join to compel an opening up and a slowing down of this, mechanism of forcing the banks to GATT, even before we have all discussed whether that is the best framework to assist the banks out of their current predicament.
Now, you've brought in the IMF. Now, just two quick questions before you take leave of us, because I know that you have to attend to some other assignments. But curiously, you have left out, because I've looked at the institutions and the persons you've addressed, and I see CEO, Ghana Bankers Association, CEO, GATT, Speaker of Parliament, Attorney General, Minister for Justice, you've the leadership of Parliament, Board Chairman, all banks in Ghana, there's Country Director, World Bank Office, Ghana. But you didn't think that it was necessary to address the Finance Minister about this, even though you have mentioned the Finance Minister quite copiously in your article. Why? Why did you leave him out?
That must have been an omission, but it will get to him. I'm sure it will get to him.
Okay, so let's look at this now. Lastly, the International Monetary Fund team, because you have to leave us, you have a few minutes to go. Now, lastly, the International Monetary Fund team negotiating with the government of Ghana should be mindful of pushing conditions that would ultimately lead to a collapse of the financial sector of Ghana. And you're requesting of them to keep an eye on measures being taken by the Finance Minister, which, in your view, could result in domestic bank owners being expropriated of their assets in these banks. Now, you're saying our parliament must also rise to the occasion and demand that the people's representative must be the ultimate authorizers of the DDE program, ultimate responsibility of the Bank of Ghana. Even though my recommendations for concerted action to stem the direction of collapse of the financial sector and unjust takeover, I write to you, the governor of the central bank, because you have ultimate responsibility for the health and well-being of the financial sector in Ghana. Its collapse under your watch indicts you. In view of the immediately foregoing, this letter points to lapses, potential criminal schemes, and dangers that you must thoroughly investigate and take steps to prevent. Please accept considerations of my highest regards and assistance that will take every step necessary to ensure the right thing to do. How does the IMF come in?
Well,
what can they do?
Because the finance minister's desperate efforts to restructure our debts is a function of conditions that have been given to him by the IMF.
Right.
The IMF is saying, look, your debt is just too much. And if we lend our money to you, it might just go into paying off these debts. And so, it won't lead to the productive sectors of the economy that will cause production and then revenue be generated to pay us back. So can you go and then rethink your debt? And it is his desperate effort to deal with the debt that, in my opinion, leads him to see an opportunity to work out a mechanism in which these existing bank owners, lose their banks to people that, we don't know. So I'm also asking the IMF, given that at this point, they seem to have more power and control over the finance minister than any of us. So at this point in time, the IMF, when they give indications to the finance minister that, we're having these discussions with you, but we also have our eyes on the property rights of existing bank owners and the way in which you seek to help them out. You understand that?
Again.
That they have that influence, that capacity to shape the policy direction that the finance minister seeks to take.
Okay.
And that's why I seek to rope them in, that, well, this your condition is causing the man to behave this way, and this behavior may cause this. You could just caution him and say, look, we've come across this communication. We have our eyes on this, and so we're watching. And so if there's a way in which we can restructure our discussion so that these consequences don't attend upon these existing bank owners, then we can look at those options.